When the police sirens cut through the quiet of Briar Glen Estates, I was still sitting in the cab of my excavator, and Vanessa Crowley, the president of our homeowners association, was standing outside the fence line pointing at me like she had just caught a criminal in the act. She told the responding officers that I had gone rogue with heavy machinery and was tearing apart the community parking lot out of spite, and she wanted me pulled from the cab and handcuffed in front of every neighbor who had gathered to watch. But when one of the officers looked down into the hole my bucket had just opened, he was not looking at a broken water main or a cracked sewer pipe. He was looking at a curved sheet of black metal, a corner of a license plate, and a thin silver bracelet caught in the crumbled concrete, engraved with 2 letters that would end up meaning a great deal more than either of us expected that morning. I want to start before any of that, because none of it makes sense unless you understand what Briar Glen was supposed to be. Vanessa had built her entire reputation on the idea that this neighborhood did not tolerate mediocrity, and she said that phrase so often that some of us started saying it back to her as a joke. The parking lot behind the community clubhouse was her crowning achievement, the one she cut a ribbon for, the one she photographed herself standing in front of, with her arms crossed like she had personally poured every inch of it. She put that photograph in the community newsletter with a headline about vision and leadership, and for a few months nobody argued with her, because the asphalt was smooth and the lines were freshly painted, and it genuinely did look like something out of a magazine. 6 months later, a crack opened down the center of that lot, thin at first, then wide enough to catch the toe of a shoe. Every time it rained, the surface sank a little deeper, and water that used to run off toward the storm drain started backing up toward 3 houses near the low end of the property. People started noticing a smell of standing mud around the drain grates that had never been there before. The kind of smell that tells you something underneath is not draining the way it should. Vanessa refused to authorize any kind of subsurface inspection because admitting the project needed a second look felt to her, like admitting the project had been flawed from the start, and she was not built for that kind of admission. I walked that crack myself more than once in the early evenings, the way I do with any drainage problem near my own street, kneeling down to feel how cold and damp the asphalt had gone right at the seam. A healthy pour does not sweat moisture like that, not unless there is a void somewhere underneath drawing water sideways instead of letting it pass straight down into the soil. I noticed the grass along the low fence line had started to yellow in a long, uneven stripe, the kind of dying pattern that usually points to a buried obstruction diverting groundwater away from where the roots expected to find it. None of it screamed disaster on its own, but taken together, it read like a slow leak in a story someone was still trying to finish telling. She called it ordinary surface settling, the sort of thing that happens to any new pour, and she said it with such confidence that most residents simply nodded and moved on. I do drainage and excavation work for a living, and I watched the way the water was moving after each storm, and it did not look like settling to me. It looked like something underneath was blocking a line that used to run clear. I put together a short written notice explaining what I was seeing and sent it to the board, expecting at worst to be ignored. But instead I got a new fine in my mailbox within the week, this one accusing my parked excavator of being an eyesore that violated the community's aesthetic guidelines. When I offered, in writing, to bring in ground-penetrating radar and check the subsurface at my own expense, just to put the question to rest, Vanessa's response was immediate and oddly sharp for someone who claimed there was nothing to worry about. She told me in no uncertain terms that I was to stay away from that parking lot, that no unauthorized contractor would be poking around community infrastructure, and that any further attempt on my part to involve outside equipment would be treated as trespassing. I remember sitting with that email for a long moment, because a woman who was so certain there was nothing wrong should not have sounded that frightened of someone simply looking. I did not think about it again until a storm rolled through that dropped almost 3 inches of rain in a single night. And by morning the parking lot had sunk another 3 inches on top of everything it had already lost. That kind of movement is not cosmetic. It is the sign of something failing underneath, and if the blockage was pushing water toward the drainage corridor that ran along the edge of the property, it was only a matter of time before it started flooding the crawl spaces of the nearest homes. I called the county engineering office directly, sent them photographs, old survey maps I had pulled from public record, and elevation readings I had taken myself with a laser level. Elliot Dane came out from the county the same afternoon, walked the perimeter of the lot with a folder of old plats under his arm, and told me something that changed the whole shape of the problem. The parking lot sat directly on top of a recorded drainage easement, a corridor the county was legally entitled to access in an emergency, with or without the homeowners association's blessing. He explained that his office had sent 2 separate warning letters to the HOA before construction even began, flagging the encroachment and asking for a redesign, and that neither letter had ever received a response. When I asked who had signed for those letters, he checked his file and told me the acknowledgement of receipt had gone out under Vanessa's own name. Because the storm had created an active flood risk and my equipment was already staged nearby, the county issued me an emergency excavation permit on the spot, the kind reserved for situations where waiting for a full review could cause real property damage. I gave the homeowners association 24 hours of written notice before I moved a single scoop of dirt, put up barrier fencing around the work area, posted warning signage, and set a camera on the site the way I do for every job, permitted or not. None of that was optional for me. It is simply how I protect myself and everyone around me when I am the one holding the controls of a machine that size. Vanessa showed up before I had even finished staking the perimeter, and she told me flatly that a county permit meant nothing inside what she called her private community. I explained, as calmly as I could, that the homeowners association did not own the easement corridor, that the county's authority there was independent of any neighborhood bylaw, and that I had already notified the board in writing the day before. She reached out and pulled the printed copy of the permit right out of my hand, told me I would not be digging so much as 1 inch of that lot, and turned to walk away as if the conversation were over. I looked at the water pooling near the storm drain, thought about the 3 houses downhill, and made the decision to bring the excavator in anyway, inside the exact boundary the county had marked, because delay was not a neutral choice. Delay meant water in somebody's living room by the next hard rain. The moment my bucket peeled back the first layer of asphalt, Vanessa stepped past the barrier tape with her phone raised and recording, and she did not stop talking for the better part of 10 minutes. She told everyone within earshot that I was retaliating against the association for the fines I had received, that I had no business operating heavy equipment inside a residential community, and that my machine could compromise the stability of the whole street. I did not argue with any of it in the moment. I simply turned the excavator so the camera could see the permit number stenciled on the door, the painted boundary lines on the pavement, and Elliot's signature on the authorization sitting on my dashboard. None of the paperwork mattered to her. She threatened to have my equipment seized, to sue my company into the ground, and to make sure I lost the house I had lived in on the edge of that neighborhood for years. I kept working because the water was not going to wait for her to calm down, and a few feet down the color of the soil changed in a way that made me stop and look twice. Mixed into what should have been clean base rock was broken concrete rubble and construction debris, the unmistakable signature of a contractor who had used cheap fill instead of the engineered material the plans called for. Vanessa saw that mixed layer of debris the same moment I did, and something in her posture changed. She was not simply worried about a damaged parking lot anymore. She told me to stop immediately, but her eyes kept drifting toward a spot near the fourth light pole, the same spot over and over, in a way that had nothing to do with asphalt or drainage. When I shifted the excavator to line up with exactly that spot, she turned her back on the whole scene and walked several yards away with her phone pressed to her ear, and I heard her tell the dispatcher that a man was out of control with heavy machinery and might hurt someone if they did not get there fast. She did not call the police when the digging started. She called them the moment I moved toward that one specific patch of ground, and that distinction sat with me the rest of the afternoon, because panic like that does not usually attach itself to a random square of dirt. 2 patrol cars arrived with their lights still turning, and Vanessa ran toward them before either officer had fully stepped out of the vehicle, telling them I had threatened her and trespassed on private property. She wanted me pulled out of the cab and handcuffed right there in front of the gathered residents, as though a public arrest would settle the argument once and for all. I shut the engine down, kept both hands visible, and did exactly what the responding officer asked of me, because I had nothing to hide and no interest in making a bad situation worse. Officer Grant Sutter walked the site with a patience that told me right away he was not going to be rushed into anything. He checked my excavation permit, my company's insurance certificate, the county's emergency authorization, and the easement map I kept folded in a plastic sleeve for exactly this kind of confrontation. He called Elliot directly, and Elliot confirmed everything within a minute, including the fact that the Homeowners Association had been formally notified the day before work began. Grant told Vanessa, evenly and without any heat in his voice, that disagreeing with a project did not turn a permitted job into a crime. Vanessa changed her story on the spot, suggesting the permit might be forged and demanding they check whether I had stolen the excavator itself, since a man in my line of work should not, in her words, have access to equipment that size. The registration on file with the county cleared that up in under a minute, and I could see a few of my neighbors start to shift their weight, the way people do when they realize they have been listening to something that was never quite true. One woman who had been nodding along with Vanessa only minutes earlier crossed her arms and looked away toward the fence line instead, and I understood, watching her, that this was probably the first crack in a story a lot of people in that neighborhood had believed for a long time simply because it was easier than questioning it. I thought the whole ordeal was finally winding down until Grant leaned over the edge of the excavation and went very still, looking at a dark, glossy surface just beneath the loosened dirt. At first he guessed it was an old buried pipe, something forgotten from a previous project, but the surface curved in a way no pipe curves, and there was a faint sheen of automotive paint along one edge that no drainage line would ever have. He called everyone back several steps and asked me to switch to the small bucket and work in careful, shallow passes. Within a few minutes, the rounded shape of a vehicle roof broke the surface, along with the narrow fin of an antenna still standing upright after everything that had been poured on top of it. Vanessa did not lean forward to look the way everyone else did. She started backing slowly toward her own car, one step at a time, and I noticed it before anyone else seemed to, because I was the only one still watching her instead of the whole. Grant called an immediate halt to all work and treated the parking lot as a potential scene, the same way he would treat any unexplained discovery buried on private property. Within the hour, an investigative unit arrived along with a recovery crew and a county technician to help stabilize the surrounding ground before anyone touched the vehicle further. I was asked to keep operating the excavator, but only under close direction, clearing dirt from around the object without disturbing it, since a careless scoop could destroy whatever evidence was down there. Bit by bit, a black sport utility vehicle emerged, its roof crushed and its rear window shattered, buried at an angle that told its own story before anyone said a word. It had not simply fallen into a natural depression in the ground. Someone had dug a hole large enough to receive it, guided the vehicle down into that hole, and then filled and compacted the space above it with the same base material and fresh asphalt used for the rest of the lot. Grant worked a gloved hand along the rear bumper and uncovered the corner of a license plate, streaked with mud but still legible. Vanessa suggested, almost too quickly, that the vehicle must have been buried there long before the association ever purchased the land. But the parking lot sat on ground the community had owned and maintained for decades, and I reminded her, quietly, that I had personally supervised the original excavation for this exact project only 6 months earlier. One of my neighbors, standing near the fence, said out loud that the wheel design looked exactly like the model Vanessa herself used to drive before she suddenly switched vehicles that spring. She denied it immediately, insisting thousands of vehicles shared that same wheel pattern, but her voice had lost the sharp confidence it carried only minutes before. When the mud was finally rinsed from the plate, Grant read the characters aloud into his radio, and dispatch came back within seconds, confirming the vehicle had been reported stolen. The registered owner on file was Vanessa Crowley. For a long moment, nobody said anything at all, and then Vanessa turned the accusation back on me with a speed that almost impressed me, claiming I must have stolen her vehicle myself and buried it as some twisted act of revenge against the association. She reminded everyone that I owned heavy equipment, understood how to move earth, and clearly had the skill to hide something this size without anyone noticing. A few neighbors looked at each other uncertainly, because on the surface, before you thought it through, the accusation almost sounded plausible. I had to explain calmly that my excavator carries a tracking system that logs its exact location and operating hours going back nearly 2 years, the kind of thing every serious contractor uses for insurance and liability reasons. That log showed the machine had never been anywhere near this parking lot during the weeks the vehicle would have needed to be buried. My work records placed me on a job more than 80 miles away on the night her vehicle was reported stolen, and my own home security camera showed the excavator sitting untouched in my yard for the entire window in question. Mara Keene, the detective who arrived not long after, began asking Vanessa a series of pointed questions almost as soon as she stepped onto the site. Vanessa claimed her vehicle had been stolen from outside a restaurant on a Friday evening, though she could not quite settle on the time she had actually left that restaurant, offering 3 slightly different versions within the space of a few minutes. Mara asked why the insurance file showed a payout of nearly $74,000 issued to her only 3 weeks after the theft was reported, a number that seemed to catch Vanessa off guard even though it was presumably her own claim. Vanessa insisted she was the victim in all of this and demanded the police turn their attention to me instead of interrogating her about paperwork. While she talked, I found myself thinking back to the final layer of pavement for this lot, poured on a weekend that lined up almost exactly with the weekend her vehicle vanished. June Halbrook, who had served as the community treasurer before all of this, confirmed that Vanessa had personally requested the contractor work through the night to, in her words, stay on schedule, and that no inspection report existed for that particular overnight shift. Mara turned to Vanessa and asked her one simple question that seemed to hang over the whole gathering. How, she wanted to know, could Vanessa have possibly guessed the vehicle was buried too deep for my excavator to have placed it there today, unless she already knew exactly how deep it had been buried and when? Because Vanessa had made criminal accusations against me over the phone, the department pulled the recording of her original emergency call as a matter of standard procedure. In that recording, she told the dispatcher I was digging directly above something she described as a place that should not be touched. When the dispatcher asked whether there was a gas line or any hazardous material buried at that location, Vanessa answered, without hesitation, that it was not a pipe. That single phrase told investigators she already knew something specific was down there before any officer had laid eyes on the vehicle. Vanessa tried to explain it away as a guess based on old construction drawings she had once reviewed, but Elliot pulled the approved plans for the lot and confirmed there was no utility vault, storage chamber, or buried structure anywhere near that location. Another detail surfaced when the recording was reviewed a second time. Vanessa had asked the dispatcher to get officers there quickly before, in her own words, I touched the roof, even though at that point the vehicle's roof still sat nearly 2 feet beneath the surface and was invisible to anyone who had not seen it go into the ground themselves. Mara did not move to arrest Vanessa on the spot, choosing instead to let her keep talking, and the more she talked, the more her explanations began contradicting one another. Vanessa pivoted to criticizing the responding officers directly, accusing them of protecting what she called an ordinary laborer over the elected president of the community. Grant answered simply that a title within a homeowners association carried no legal immunity of any kind. With her attorney present, Vanessa agreed to hand over her phone under standard evidence preservation procedure, and Mara asked the department to track down Wade Kessler, the contractor whose company had built the parking lot in the first place. When officers tried to reach Wade's office, they found it closed, his phone disconnected, and several project files missing from the Homeowners Association's own server, as though someone had gone through them recently and removed exactly what mattered. Before Mara left the site that first day, she told me quietly that the vehicle was only the first thing Vanessa had tried to bury. The recovery crew lifted the crushed vehicle out of the ground using cable lines and a small crane, working slowly to keep the surrounding soil from collapsing further into the hole. There was no body inside and no sign of violence, which ruled out the darkest possibility everyone on that site had quietly been imagining since the antenna first broke the surface. What the trunk did contain, sealed inside 2 waterproof storage boxes wrapped in heavy plastic, was almost as damning in its own way. Inside those boxes were Homeowners Association invoices, signed voting proxies, contractor agreements, and printed bank statements, the kind of paper trail most people shred rather than bury under a parking lot. Several of the signatures on the voting proxies looked suspiciously identical to one another, the sort of pattern that suggests one hand signed a name meant to belong to someone else. And it raised immediate questions about whether the vote approving the parking lot project had ever been legitimate. The invoices showed the association had paid out more than $418,000 for the project, while records from Wade's own company suggested the real cost of materials and labor came closer to $190,000. A portion of the difference had been routed to a consulting firm called Crowley Community Strategies, a company registered under the name of Vanessa's cousin, with no employees, no office, and no visible services rendered to anyone. Tucked inside the same box were copies of Elliot's original warning letters about the drainage easement, the very letters Vanessa had sworn, more than once, she had never received. June recognized another folder immediately, a set of documents she had assembled herself for an audit she had requested before the board forced her out of her position as treasurer. Vanessa had always claimed those records were lost to a computer error. Yet here they were, in her own vehicle, buried under her own parking lot. Investigators also found a handwritten tow receipt showing the vehicle had been delivered to this exact construction site on the night it was reported stolen, signed at the bottom by Wade Kessler. Vanessa tried once more to suggest a thief could have taken both her vehicle and her private documents and buried everything together purely to frame her. But Mara pointed out that no random thief could have known which audit to steal, which contract to hide, or exactly which weekend the parking lot would be poured over the top of it all. Near the driver's seat, technicians found a thin silver bracelet engraved with the letters V and C, the very item Vanessa had listed as lost along with the vehicle when she filed her insurance claim and for which she had collected an additional payout on top of the vehicle itself. It was becoming clear that this vehicle was never simply a stolen car case. It had become the one place Vanessa believed no one would ever think to look again, a private vault she assumed the earth itself would keep sealed forever. 2 days later, Wade Kessler walked into the department alongside his attorney and offered to cooperate, rather than wait to see how much investigators would uncover without him. He admitted that Vanessa had called him personally on the night the vehicle disappeared, asking him to bring a tow truck out to the construction site after his crew had already gone home for the day. She told him the vehicle had become a legal liability and needed to stay out of sight until she could sort things out with her insurance company on her own terms. In exchange for his cooperation that night, Wade was allowed to inflate the contract price, cut corners on the required base material, and secure the association's next maintenance contract without any competing bids. He had originally assumed the vehicle would only sit hidden on site for a few days before being quietly moved elsewhere, but Vanessa surprised him by insisting it be buried permanently, along with the boxes of paperwork, right there beneath the new pavement. She told him a fresh layer of concrete would ensure nobody found it for decades, and given how much money he had already accepted, Wade felt he had little choice but to go along with it, terrified his own bid-rigging scheme would come out if he refused. Text messages between Wade and Vanessa still existed on a cloud backup neither of them had thought to delete. In one message, Vanessa wrote that once the base layer was compacted, both the vehicle and the audit would cease to exist as far as anyone else was concerned. Wade also revealed that the cheap fill material packed around the buried vehicle had left the surrounding soil unstable from the very beginning, creating a hollow pocket that redirected rainwater and slowly choked off part of the drainage line beneath the lot. In other words, Vanessa's own effort to hide the truth had created the very crack that eventually forced the county to authorize my emergency excavation. If she had never buried that vehicle in the first place, the parking lot might never have sunk, and her secret might have stayed buried for years longer than it did. Vanessa tried to shift the entirety of the blame onto Wade, insisting he alone had decided how and where to dispose of the vehicle. But the signatures, the messages, and the financial trail all led directly back to her own decisions, one after another. Wade told investigators he had barely slept in the weeks after the burial, driving past the lot at odd hours just to make sure the surface still looked undisturbed, half convinced a stray dog or a curious teenager would stumble onto something before the final layer of asphalt went down. He said Vanessa called him twice during that window, once to confirm the schedule for the final pour, and once simply to remind him what would happen to both of their reputations if anyone ever found out what sat beneath it. He described her voice on those calls as calm, in a way that unsettled him more than shouting would have, the tone of someone who had already decided the risk was worth taking and only needed him to agree. By the time investigators finished laying out his phone records beside hers, the timeline left no real space for the version of events Vanessa kept trying to offer instead. Sitting with Mara later that afternoon, I watched her lay each document out on the tailgate of a department truck, photographing every page before it went into an evidence bag. There were maintenance logs that had been altered after the fact, dates changed in a different pen than the rest of the entry, and a stack of vendor quotes that never seemed to have gone out to more than one bidder despite the association's own bylaws requiring competitive pricing on anything over a modest amount. Mara noted that whoever packed those boxes had done it carefully, almost lovingly, the way a person protects something they intend to use later rather than something they mean to throw away. It told her, she said, that Vanessa had never planned to destroy this evidence at all. She had planned to keep it close, buried but retrievable, in case she ever needed leverage against Wade or anyone else who might turn on her down the road. Even with the evidence mounting against her by the day, Vanessa called an emergency meeting of the Homeowners Association, determined to have me formally removed from the community before the investigation could run its full course. She sent out a notice accusing me of destroying shared property and costing the association hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages, and she asked the remaining board members to approve a lawsuit against me, the seizure of my equipment, and a permanent ban on my company operating anywhere inside Briar Glen. I attended with my attorney, along with Elliot and June, prepared to lay out exactly what had actually happened. Vanessa opened the meeting with a long speech, presenting herself as the target of what she called a coordinated smear campaign against her leadership. She played footage of my excavator tearing into the pavement, carefully leaving out any mention of the emergency permit or the drainage easement that made the work entirely legal in the first place. I did not respond with anger or raised voices. I simply walked the room through the county easement map, the original warning letters, the excavator's own location data, and a clear timeline showing exactly when and why I had been called to that site. June stood and read aloud from an email chain proving Vanessa had deliberately withheld every one of Elliot's warnings from the rest of the board for months. Elliot explained, in plain terms, that the parking lot would have to be removed entirely, since it had been built directly over an active drainage corridor using materials that never should have passed inspection in the first place. Vanessa tried to spread the responsibility across the whole board, insisting every decision had been approved collectively and fairly. June answered that claim by producing copies of the falsified voting proxies recovered from the buried vehicle, the same names appearing again and again in handwriting that did not match. Several residents whose names appeared on those proxies stood up on their own, one after another, and said plainly that they had never signed or agreed to any such vote. One older man near the back, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Briar Glen longer than almost anyone in the room, said he had never even received a ballot for that particular project, let alone signed one, and he wanted to know how many other votes over the years might have looked the same way. Vanessa's composure finally broke, and she demanded that security remove me from the room immediately, as though ending the conversation could undo everything already on the table. At that exact moment, Mara and Grant walked into the meeting with a search warrant for the association's office and records. Mara played a portion of the original emergency call for the entire room, focusing on the lines where Vanessa described the exact depth and location of something she claimed not to know was there at all. Every person in that room understood, almost at once, that the very call Vanessa had made to have me arrested had become the clearest piece of evidence against her. Before the meeting ended, Mara informed the board that Vanessa's access to every association account, file, and device was suspended for the duration of the investigation, effective immediately. The financial review that followed confirmed what the buried paperwork had already suggested, that Vanessa and Wade had inflated the cost of the parking lot project and quietly split the difference through a chain of shell arrangements neither of them had bothered to hide very carefully. Vanessa used part of that money to pay down a personal loan and to fund her own re-election campaign within the association, the very campaign that had promised residents a community free of waste and mismanagement. On top of all of that, she had also collected a substantial insurance payout for a vehicle she herself had arranged to disappear. Residents had been asked to pay a special assessment fee specifically to help fund the parking lot, while Vanessa quietly profited from the very same project they had trusted her to oversee on their behalf. Worse still, the lot could not simply be patched or repaired. The entire structure had to be torn out completely in order to restore the drainage corridor beneath it and prevent the same flooding risk from returning the following season. Her attorney attempted to negotiate a quieter resolution, but the documents recovered from the vehicle, the text messages between her and Wade, Wade's own statement to investigators, and the emergency call recording together formed a chain of evidence that left very little room to maneuver. Vanessa ultimately faced charges connected to insurance fraud, embezzlement of association funds, falsification of records, and obstruction related to blocking a legitimate inspection of community infrastructure. I will not describe the exact moment she left that meeting room in any dramatic detail, because it does not need embellishment to matter. Before she walked out, she turned back toward me and said, "I had destroyed the entire neighborhood just to prove myself right about a parking lot." I told her I had only dug down to the exact point where the drainage line had been blocked, and that she was the one who had decided what would be waiting for me when I got there. The remaining members of the board voted that same evening to suspend her from any further role in the association and to bring in an independent auditor to review every project approved during her time as president. Every fine she had ever levied against me over the placement of my equipment was formally voided as part of that same vote. The association agreed to reimburse my company for the emergency excavation work, though I chose not to charge them the late payment penalties I would have been entitled to add. I wanted the neighborhood to see, clearly and without any speeches from me, the difference between holding someone accountable and simply trying to destroy them out of spite. Several months later, the parking lot was removed in its entirety, board by board, until nothing remained of the surface Vanessa had once posed in front of for her newsletter photograph. The old drainage line was fully restored, and the space above it was converted into a natural, landscaped basin designed to handle heavy rainfall the way the original engineering plans had always intended. The new board made every project budget public from that point forward and required at least 3 independent bids before approving any expense above a modest threshold. June was asked to return as a temporary financial advisor to help rebuild the association's records, but she declined the chance to become president herself, saying she had seen firsthand what happens when too much authority settles into a single set of hands. Elliot told me privately that if the excavation had been delayed even a few more weeks, the next major storm could have flooded several homes along the low end of the property before anyone understood why. A handful of residents who had once sided firmly with Vanessa eventually came to apologize to me directly, and I did not ask any of them to explain themselves or pick a side out loud. My excavator still sits on my own property exactly where it always has, though there are no more fine notices taped to my front door threatening me over where I choose to park it. A few of the newer families in the neighborhood have started waving when they pass, something that never happened much before, and I have come to think it has less to do with the machine itself and more to do with what people now understand it was actually protecting. The insurance company that paid out on Vanessa's stolen vehicle claim is pursuing repayment through the courts, and the Homeowners Association has filed its own civil action to recover what was taken from the community fund. Wade accepted responsibility for his part in the scheme, lost his contractor's license, and agreed to hand over every remaining file connected to the project in exchange for a reduced set of charges. I still think, from time to time, about the way Vanessa stood at the edge of that hole, demanding officers pull me out of the cab before my bucket could reach whatever she already knew was waiting underneath. She had built her entire image in that neighborhood on layer after layer of concealment, a layer of soil, a layer of gravel, a layer of fresh asphalt, and beneath all of it, a much older layer of lies she had convinced herself would never see daylight. It only takes one small crack for water to find its way down through all of that, and it turns out the truth tends to travel along the very same path. The story ends, for me, with the image of my own machine passing back over that same stretch of ground, this time finishing the drainage channel the way it always should have been built. Grant stopped by the site near the end of the work and joked that this was probably the first time in his career that an emergency call meant to get someone arrested had ended up leading investigators straight to the very thing the caller had spent months trying to hide. I looked out over the freshly graded earth where the parking lot used to sit and thought about how close Vanessa had come to keeping her secret buried forever. If only she had not been so desperate to stop me from digging in the first place. Some evenings I still catch myself standing at the edge of that basin after the crew has gone home, watching the water settle into the new channel the way it was always supposed to, quiet and unremarkable, exactly how good drainage should look. There is nothing dramatic about a system that works. No cracked pavement, no standing mud, no smell that makes a person stop and wonder what is happening underneath their feet. I think that is the part Vanessa never understood about the ground she was so determined to control. It does not care about reputations or newsletters or ribbon cuttings. It only ever wants an honest path down, and sooner or later it finds one, whether you built it for that purpose or not. Vanessa called the police that morning hoping to stop my excavator from uncovering her past. Instead, her own call was the thing that told them exactly where to dig.